All right, welcome back everybody to Tech Bytes and our first week of the Intro to Programming course, aka if you're coming back from our Python session, which we did over the summer months of June and July, welcome back to the 9th week of the Python session. And we'll be doing a lot more involving the programming language of Python, and you may or may not have attended last week's course of web development, where we continued and picked off from where we left off in the JavaScript curriculum. Now, today, you may notice that I am alone and that Andrew is not here. Well, if you have not already been updated, haven't been keeping up in the Google Classroom, well, Andrew has now departed off to college, so wish him good luck there. And for the time being, I will be leading all of the courses in the Intro to Programming course, the web development course, if you're into our Hack Central program, and the Team Trivia. So we'll be sure to, have a great time, learn some cool things, and yeah, keep the Tech Bytes going. So welcome along, and without any further ado, let's get started. For those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Rayan Siddiqui. I'm a rising senior at James B. Cohen High School. I love to code. I've made several apps for the App Store, made a dozen different websites, always trying to learn new languages, new frameworks. You can check out my website at rayansiddiqui.com if you want to learn more about me. All right, so for today's agenda, we're going to be recapping what we did from the Python sessions, just to have a foundation, get everybody on the same page. And, if you want to check out our old videos, we'll link that as well. We are going to discuss some new terminology, such as Booleans and parameters. And then we'll try to apply these concepts into actual code. All right, so if you are new and you have not already joined our Google Classroom, be sure to do so. This is where I communicate with all of our information, the weekly recaps. You can find the link to the code, which I go over every week, and you can find the link to our old sessions as well. So here is the code. I will drop it in the chat in case we have some new participants here today. There you go. So be sure to stay here and you'll receive all sorts of communication from Tech Bytes. And yeah. Also, if you are wondering when I'm saying what are old sessions and you're wondering what is the Python session, well, you can find all of our old videos and the links all on the Schomburg Library's YouTube channel. There is a playlist dedicated to Tech Bytes and Hack Central, and it should be called Tech Bytes. There you can find all of our past 2 months content, where Andrew and we went over all of our past 2 months curriculum, and you can find answers to many questions. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me live right now or communicate them through the Google Classroom. All right, so a quick recap of what we covered throughout the Python session in the Python course. Well, we started off pretty basic. We had a stepping block of starting out with block coding. Then we started to learn about different coding concepts, such as variables and how they hold values, and how variables are very essential in different applications. We learned about functions and typing out functions. We learned about different types of loops, such as for loops and while loops, and how they work, along with important statements such as the logic statements and how if-else statements work. And we applied all of these concepts in order to make some nice and big projects. And with this new course called Intro to Programming, you can expect nothing less. We'll be diving deeper into more coding concepts, such as starting today, and we're going to be making some more, even nicer projects, which you can, show off to your friends, family, and build your enthusiasm for computer programming. All right, so let's get into today's first example, that being Booleans. Now, if you were here from last week's web development course, you remember we talked about Booleans to a moderate extent. We discussed how to type them out. Well, today I want to contrast what we learned in the JavaScript session to the Python language. So here is some basic syntax and basic definition. We learned that Booleans are essentially a way for us to hold two values, either a true value or a false value, nothing else. Now, these Booleans allow us to run for loops, run while loops, and we can check when a condition is true in order to run a certain piece of code. Now notice how we have some syntax here on how to create a Boolean variable, because at the end of the day, Booleans are still variables. They hold a value, right? So here is how we type it out. We'd simply declare the name of the variable which we want to use as our Boolean, and then we set it equal to either true or false. Now, if you were here from last week, you may notice a difference in the typing of the word true or false. Well, remember how in JavaScript we simply just type out the word true in all lowercase? Well, in Python, it's a tad bit different. We just have to capitalize the letter T and capitalize the letter F in true and false. Just a bit different syntax, not that big of a biggie. But as you can see, we can use Booleans in different applications, that one of the most important being logic statements, aka if-else statements. We can check if a Boolean has a certain value, then we can run a certain piece of code. Now, we know that Booleans are either true or false. And as we can see to the right, essentially what is, we'll talk about this a bit more into depth in the next slide, but we can see that we are checking that if the Boolean, boolvar, our Boolean variable, is true, then we're printing yes, otherwise no. Now you might be asking, hey, when are we actually checking to see if our boolvar, our Boolean variable, is true? Well, this is a shorthand command, simply that if we just type the name of our Boolean variable, this automatically insinuates that if this statement is essentially what the computer is reading, it's saying that if Boolean var is true, then run the code in the indentation. So we don't have to type out the whole thing if boolvar equals true. All right, so we know how to type out Boolean variables. We know what they hold, but let's dive deeper into something called De Morgan's Law and how Booleans can be manipulated. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but let's take it one piece at a time. Now, in computer programming, you will learn that Booleans are essential. At this point, you might be like, okay, so they can just hold a true or false value, but what use are they really to me? Well, they're pretty important because a majority of the time, how we use them is manipulating them and seeing if if multiple Booleans and variables are true or false, and then we run certain pieces of code. So let's take a simple one step at a time. We have a Boolean var called boolvar equals true right here. Now here's another shorthand command. If we put an exclamation mark in front of our Boolean variable, that implies that our Boolean variable is then false, or we're checking for a false condition. Now here is where the good stuff comes in and how we can manipulate our Booleans. Now say we have two Booleans. We want to check if both are true, then we will run a certain piece of code. And say otherwise we want to check if both are false, then we'll run a different piece of code. Or otherwise we might just want to check if one Boolean is true, then we'll run a piece of code. So here's how it works. There's first something called and is certainly what it implies. It is checking if both conditions or both Boolean variables have a certain value, then a certain piece of code will run. So say in this example, the one I'm highlighting with the red marker, we have our Boolean variable declared as true. So true and true evaluates to true because we have two trues. However, if we say true, which our Boolean var is true, and false, that is going to evaluate to false. Now you might be confused, why is true and false false? Well, whenever we use the keyword and, both values have to be the same in order for the code to run. In this case, true and false, they're obviously two separate values. Hence, our program would not run the piece of code or output to us false. Furthermore, since right here we have true and true, we are outputted with true. Now, there's something else called or. This is a bit opposite of and in this case, both values do not have to be the same, but instead, either or value can be true. Now, you might be a bit confused. What do you mean by either value can be true? Well, essentially now, since we have our Boolean variable declared as true, true or true Well, we have one true, so we'll choose true. It's outputted. And in this case now, if we have true and false, true is going to be outputted, or whatever code we want to run will run now, because in an or scenario, so if we have or, the true value will always, essentially, if you think about it, will always bulldoze or have importance and allow for a piece of code to run. However, in and, think of and being very specific. We need both or even sometimes more values to be the same for a piece of code to run. Now we have an example to the right here in actual Python. We can see if our Boolean variable is true and false, then the word yes should be outputted. However, true and false, they're not the same. So what is being outputted? The word no. And a counterexample, if our variable was instead false, then our program would have outputted yes. All right. So now for our last example for today, before we jump into actual coding these concepts, that being parameters in Python. Now, before we discuss the syntax, what are parameters? Well, parameters are essentially a value, which you can see right here, which we pass into a function. Now, when you perform essentially a routine, you want to do something based off that situation. And using parameters, they allow us to reuse our functions, and we'll talk about why are parameters useful. And as you can see to the left, we've even talked about parameters in our JavaScript curriculum, in our web development curriculum over the past couple of weeks. And essentially what we can see is we simply have to write a variable inside of the parentheses of our function, and then we can call our function passing a value for that parameter, and then we can manipulate that value. Now you might be a bit confused as to what is the use of parameters and why even use parameters? Why not just use some local variables, which we've learned about, and just use them inside of our function? Well, it's funny you might ask. Well, because parameters are super useful as you learn more and more about computer programming, because they lead you towards abstraction. Now, we're not talking about art abstraction, but in a sense, it is art abstraction because you're simplifying your code in a sense that you're able to reuse aspects of your code. So if you go back to this third example, we look at this function. This function can be used in different scenarios. That is because we've used a parameter. So multiple values we can pass in and see different outputs. But say we hard-coded the variable inside of our function run to have a value 5. Well, then we would have to change it every single time. But with parameters, we can abstract our code and use a function multiple times in many different applications. And although it's not something which is like super duper important at this point in our coding stages, it's still something to know in the back of your head that whenever we can clean up our code or simplify our code, we should always do such, because it not only is more readable to you and the computer programmers, but it's especially helpful to your local machine and whatever computer you're using. All right, so we've talked about a bunch of cool things today, from Booleans to parameters and manipulation. How about we actually put that into practice and launch up our coding website? I will drop the link to the website in the chat. There we go. All right, so if everybody could please open up the website, and please let me know in the chat when you are there, and we shall begin. Yep, so just let me know in the chat when everybody is here, and then we'll begin. All right, so let's get started by actually applying our concepts, which we learned about today. Let's start off with the first concept we learned about, that being Booleans. So now this, you might be asking, I just wrote a word into my code. Well, if we use the hashtag symbol, essentially what this allows us to do is to comment code so we can write comments. You don't have to do this, it's just so you guys can see and visualize it properly. So let's start off with Booleans. So how about we create our first ever Boolean? We'll call it first Boolean, and we'll set it equal to, how about true? Oh, remember, it's a capital T, like such. Now, how about if we print out the value of our Boolean? So how about we just do print first Boolean, like such, and we should see the word true being printed out, meaning that our Boolean has a value of true. So how about we write a logic statement or an if-else statement to see how our Booleans can help us in other pieces of code. So we know how to do an if statement. We'll do if. We'll do, how about we do we'll do two versions. So how about this? If first Boolean equals true, then we'll print out our Boolean is true, like such. And then otherwise, else, we'll say print our Boolean is false. Give you guys a quick moment there to catch up. Now, before I execute this piece of code, there's something which we always iterate, but we're not doing right now. That being, we have to put our code into a function, in a placeholder, right? So how about we, before we do any of this, we declare a function called, I'll call it Tech Bytes Boolean, like such. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this code and indent it so that it is part of our function. Just to clean up our code, you know. All right, so now if I run this piece of code, nothing is being printed out. Oh yes, we forgot to call our function because it's not being called, hence it won't run. So how about we just type the name of our function? This way we can call it like this. Now, if I run my piece of code, we should, how about I ask you guys, what do you guys think is going to be printed out? Any guesses to which statement will be printed out? All right, yep. So the first statement should be printed out if we coded this correctly, and if we hit execute, we see that our Boolean is true is printed out because our Boolean variable holds the value of true. All right, so now how about we do something different and look at a shortcut? You might remember when a piece of code example in the slides when we were talking about was when my Boolean variable was just like this. And if I execute a piece of code, we still see that your Boolean is true, is being outputted. Well, it's because this, if we just simply write the name of our Boolean variable, this is implying that if our Boolean is true, then run the piece of code inside. So it's a nice shortcut to know in programming. All right, so how about we discuss a false Boolean now? So if I change the value of my first Boolean to false, we should see this second statement being printed out. So if I execute, there we go. We see that our Boolean is false is being printed out. All right, so we've talked about Booleans. How about we talk about the manipulation and use and ors? So let's do that. So how about we create a second Boolean variable, and I'll say that it is true, and I'm going to change the value of my first variable to true as well. And as always, guys, if you ever feel like I'm going too fast or you ever have a question, please do let me know, and we'll be glad to help you. All right, so now we have our two Boolean variables. So let's talk about how we can manipulate them and remember, De Morgan's law. So I'm just gonna comment out the piece of code, or that's fine. So let's use first the and sign, the and word. So if we do if first Boolean, and I'm just gonna leave it like this, meaning that this is evaluating that if first Boolean equals true, and then we'll do and, simply just type out the word and Python is super nice. You will notice that once we talk about De Morgan's law in the intro to the web development course this Wednesday, the syntax and how we type out the word and is a bit different. All right, so if we have if first Boolean is true and our second Boolean is true, put these in parentheses to look nicer. Then we want to print out both Booleans are true. All right, so how about we run this piece of code? And we are shortly printed out with both Booleans are true. But how about if I change the value of my second Boolean to false? So let me ask you guys, do you think that anything will be printed out now, considering what we learned about the and statement? So when this piece of code runs, will we see this line of code being printed out? Let me know in the chat. Yep, Aditi, you're absolutely correct. And if we run this, surely we see nothing is being outputted into our result box. Well, that is because since we are using the and operator, we have to make sure that both of these values are the same for this piece of code to run. So how can we make it so that our Boolean values are different, but we still see this line of code running, and the statement printed out? Well, we can change it to an or word, the or operator. So if we simply change our word and to the word or, and if I run this piece of code, we see that this statement is being printed out. Well, that is because first Boolean is true and second Boolean is false. But in an or statement, it's looking for the higher up, or whichever one is true. And since we have a true in this case, our print statement will execute. All right, so how about we apply the idea of parameters to Booleans? Now you might ask, how can we do that? Well, how about we do something like this? We have our function called Tech Bytes Boolean, but how about we pass in the value of our Booleans? So instead of me hard coding whatever the values of our Booleans represent, how about we pass them in as a parameter and abstract our code? Now, this is a really big important piece of idea, which you got to understand, is that by me applying a parameter to this function can be used multiple times and in different cases. So how about we do that? So in the parentheses, we'll say value 1, and then we'll do value 2. Now, I want to set the value of my first Boolean variable equal to the value of this, value 1. So I'm going to say first Boolean var equals value 1, and second Boolean equals value 2. Now I'm going to pull out my annotation tool to make that connection really quickly. So here is what is happening. I am transferring this value 1 is now being represented through first Boolean, and that is because of a parameter. So how about to make this a bit nicer if we actually, oops, let me clear the board. So if we pass in two Boolean variable values, so right here, say I pass in true and then false, like such. So if I pull the annotation again, what is happening is that this value, true, is being sent into our Tech Bytes Boolean function as, in disguise, if you want to think of it, as value 1. And then I'm assigning this variable, this value true, when it's assigned to value 1, I'm assigning it to my variable called first Boolean. So you see that circle, you see how everything is being managed and how our code is being cleaned up, how I can simply just enter a value right here, true or false, then that is being passed into my function. And now if we run our piece of code, we should see, and I change the statement to make it more accurate, that one Boolean has a true value. Now, if I run this code, oh, I'm mixing up my languages. Remember that in Python, true and false always have to be capital first letters. Now, if I run this piece of code, we see the line of printed out that our Boolean has a true value is outputted. That being because I'm transferring this value of true into value 1, which is then being transferred into first Boolean. All right, so that was a nice combination of us being able to see how we can combine multiple concepts today. We learned about Booleans and parameters and how we can use all that to make one nice function. Now, before we wrap up today, I want to do one more example of parameters. So I'm just going to create a separate section, like such. And then I'm going to make a new function for my parameters example. I'm just going to call it param example. Very creative. All right. Let everybody catch up. All right, so hopefully your is good. Now, for this parameter example, I want to sort of set a foundation, in a sense, for what we're going to be doing next week, a nice project, which I'll be discussing in a little bit. But how about, say, we want to check which of two numbers which we pass in are greater. So essentially what we're going to do is we want to get two numbers. So we'll say, I'll call it number 1 and number 2 as the two parameters, aka the two values we're passing in. And then we want to check which of these two numbers is greater. So if we'll do it simple, we'll say if number 1 is greater than number 2, then print out how will we do this? We'll print out the first number and say number 1 is greater. Now, this is if you remember from our web development course and how we can combine our variables and strings by using a plus sign. In Python, it's a bit different. We just use a comma to combine a variable with a word and print that out. So now we're checking right here in our logic, in our if-else statements, that if our first number is greater, then print out that number and say that it's greater. However, let's check if the second number is greater. Now we're going to be using something called an elif. Now we haven't really used this that much, so I'm going to explain it really quickly. We've talked about them, but haven't really applied them. So say we will have an if statement, but we just don't have 2 cases which can occur. Say we have 5 different scenarios which can occur. Hence, we're going to use an elif to check for different scenarios. So say if this first condition isn't met, then check this second condition. So what this is short for is that it is saying else if we'll say number 2 is greater than number 1, print out number 2 is greater. But we have one more scenario, that being what if both numbers have the same value? Well, then we have 2 options essentially. We can either use another else if to check for the condition of setting number 1 equal to number 2, or we can just use an else, because if you think about it, we don't have any other cases that we're checking for, so we know by default that we can just check for both numbers are the same. So if we just say right here, print both numbers are the same value. Let everybody catch up. Give you guys a quick minute. All right, so now if I run this piece of code and nothing is being printed out, oh yes, we forgot to call our function. So let's call our function below with param example, the name of the function. And then we gotta pass in 2 numbers. So how about I pass in the numbers 20 and 10? Now we should see the print statement of 20 is greater being printed out. And if we run this piece of code, we do see that 20 is greater being printed out. And say I make this the first value 20, 10 I mean, and the second value 20, and I run this piece of code, we still see 20 is greater being printed out. And if I were to make both of these numbers the same, and I hit the run button, we see the print statement of both numbers are the same value being printed out. So overall, this idea was to show how we can pass in values to our function and really allows us to test our function in various ways, and makes our function really reusable and cleans up our code a lot instead of me going here and explicitly saying number 1 equals 10 or whatever number I am writing. All right, so we had a really good time today. We learned about Booleans, learned about parameters, and we've learned a lot over the past 2.5 months. Over this whole summer, we've come a long way together in learning about the programming language of Python. And we, over the past, I would say 3 weeks, we took a break from making projects and we started a deep dive into some more topics. But how about we get into some more fun things starting next week, next Monday from 2 to 3 p.m. And how about we make a rock, paper, scissors game, learning about everything we've learned about parameters, Booleans, logic statements, all that good stuff, combining it into a nice big project. And yeah, so hopefully you learned something cool today, had a great time. Be sure to join the Google Classroom, and I'll catch you guys on the web development one if you're going to be joining that course. But if not, I'll catch you next Monday. Take care. See you guys.